dissolved in Yellowstone. Colin Scott was 23 years old when he visited Yellowstone National Park in June of 2016 with his sister. They arrived at the Norris Geyser Basin, the hottest and most geologically active thermal area in the entire park, on what appeared to be an ordinary afternoon. Norris Geyser Basin sits in the northwest corner of Yellowstone and holds a distinction that most visitors do not fully appreciate until they are standing inside it. The ground there is not solid in the way that ordinary ground is solid. Beneath the thin crust of soil and mineral deposits, superheated water circulates at temperatures that exceed the boiling point at sea level. The basin contains some of the most acidic thermal features found anywhere on Earth. The Park Service has spent decades constructing and maintaining an extensive network of boardwalks, specifically to keep visitors on surfaces that have been tested and confirmed to be stable. Those boardwalks wind through the basin for miles, elevated above the thermal features, positioned at distances calculated to be safe. The geology beneath Norris is part of what makes it unpredictable even by Yellowstone standards. The basin sits atop a shallow, highly active hydrothermal system fed by the same volcanic heat source that powers the rest of the park's geysers and springs. Because the system is so close to the surface and so acidic, the ground crust at Norris is thinner and less stable than in many of Yellowstone's other thermal areas. Features there can change without warning. A spring that has been calm for years can shift its temperature, its acidity, or its underlying structure within days. Park geologists monitor the basin continuously, precisely because it does not behave consistently, which is part of why the boardwalk system was built with such rigor in the first place. The warning signs at Norris are not subtle. They appear at the trailhead, at intervals along the boardwalk, and at any point where the path approaches a feature closely enough that a visitor might be tempted to step off. The signs use direct language. They prohibit off-trail walking. They describe the danger in plain terms. The crust is thin. The water's boiling. Injuries are severe and often fatal. Rangers at Yellowstone have documented thermal injuries going back generations. The park's fatality record from thermal features is long and well established. The infrastructure at Norris exists precisely because the environment there will not forgive mistakes. Scott and his sister left the boardwalk. The specific reason they moved off the designated path is documented. They were looking for what some visitors call a hot pot, an unofficial soaking pool, a thermal feature with water at a temperature suitable for swimming. This practice is illegal inside Yellowstone. The park prohibits it explicitly. The prohibition exists not as a bureaucratic inconvenience, but as a direct response to the physical reality of what the thermal features in the park actually are. Water that appears calm on the surface can be at or above boiling temperature. The mineral crust surrounding a thermal pool can give way without warning. The acidity of the water in many features is extreme enough to cause severe injury within seconds of contact. Scott moved across the thermal crust away from the boardwalk. At some point, he lost his footing. He fell into the spring. Park rangers were alerted and responded to the Norris Geyser Basin. They located the area where Scott had entered the water. Recovery was attempted. The conditions of the spring made any approach to the feature extremely dangerous, and the state of the water prevented immediate retrieval. Rangers secured the area and made the determination that a full recovery attempt would need to wait. Investigators later noted that a sudden and severe thunderstorm moved through the area shortly after the fall, which further limited what rescue personnel could safely attempt that evening. Approaching an acidic, near-boiling spring on foot, and failing light with lightning in the area, was judged too dangerous even for trained personnel equipped for hazardous recovery work. The decision to wait until morning was not made lightly, and it reflected the same calculus that governs every safety decision at Norris. The terrain does not allow for improvisation. The following morning, search and rescue personnel returned to the site. What they found confirmed what the thermal conditions had already made likely. The water in the spring, reaching temperatures of over 90 degrees Celsius, combined with the extreme acidity of the feature, had dissolved Scott's body entirely overnight. There were no recoverable remains. The fall occurred at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon and was captured on video by his sister. Scott's precise path between leaving the boardwalk and reaching the spring was not publicly confirmed. What was confirmed was the result. Colin Scott was pronounced dead. The cause was immersion in a superheated, highly acidic thermal spring. No remains were recovered. Sentinel Island Missionary. John Allen Chau was 26 years old, an American, and he had planned his approach to North Sentinel Island for months before November of 2018. North Sentinel Island sits in the Bay of Bengal, part of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands administered by India. It is approximately 60 square kilometers of dense jungle surrounded by a coral reef, and it is home to the Sentinelese, one of the last populations on Earth that has had no sustained contact with the outside world. The Sentinelese have lived on the island for an estimated 60,000 years. They have consistently, and at times violently, rejected every attempt at contact made by outsiders. Expeditions that attempted to approach the island across the 20th century were met with arrows and hostility. Indian authorities eventually formalized what the tribe had always enforced on its own terms. No one is permitted within 5 nautical miles of North Sentinel Island. The exclusion zone exists under Indian law. Violation is a criminal offense. The law applies without exception. The reasoning behind the restriction is not arbitrary. The Sentinelese have no documented exposure to the diseases common to the outside world. Contact, even brief contact, carries the risk of introducing illnesses to which the population has no immunity. Anthropologists studying isolated populations elsewhere in the world have documented cases in which first contact led to outbreaks of common illnesses, such as influenza or measles, that killed a significant portion of the population within a matter of months. The exclusion zone is designed to protect the tribe. It is also designed to protect visitors from the tribe's documented response to intrusion. Both risks are real. Both are stated clearly in the legal framework surrounding the island. Chau was aware of the exclusion zone. His journals, recovered after his death, document his knowledge of it. He had trained for the expedition for years, studying linguistics and wilderness medicine and researching the limited historical accounts of contact with the Sentinelese. He described his intentions in religious terms, framing the trip as a missionary effort. He paid local fishermen to transport him toward the island by boat. The fishermen knew the zone was illegal to enter. They brought him close enough to the island's shore that he could proceed in a kayak. On his initial approach to the beach, Sentinelese islanders responded with arrows. Chau was struck. One arrow reportedly pierced the Bible he was carrying. He retreated to the fisherman's boat. The initial approach had made the tribe's position clear. He had been warned not by a sign or a regulation, but by the people whose territory he was entering, with weapons, from a distance close enough to hit him. Chau returned to shore. His journal entries from that night, later published in excerpted form by outlets that obtained them, described his decision to go back despite the injury and despite what had already happened. He instructed the fishermen not to wait for him if he did not return by a certain time, and he told them what to do with his belongings. The fishermen waited offshore. From their position, they observed what happened on the beach. Chau did not return to the boat. The following day, the fishermen observed tribesmen dragging his body across the beach and burying it in the sand. He had been killed by the islanders. Indian authorities were notified. The fishermen who had transported Chau to the exclusion zone were arrested. Indian Coast Guard vessels approached the island to assess the situation. Recovery of the body was not attempted. Landing on North Sentinel Island in any capacity remained too dangerous, and the legal framework protecting the tribe complicated any enforcement action against the islanders themselves. Indian authorities ultimately decided not to pursue prosecution of the Sentinelese. The tribe's protected status under Indian law, combined with the fact that Chau had entered their territory illegally, shaped that determination. The fishermen faced legal proceedings for their role in the transport. John Allen Chau was confirmed dead. His body was not recovered. The cause of death was not specified with precision in official public reporting. Safari window open. Katherine Chappell was 29 years old when she visited the Lion and Safari Park near Johannesburg, South Africa, in June of 2015. The Lion and Safari Park is a self-drive wildlife facility in the Gauteng province. Visitors travel through animal enclosures in their own vehicles, observing lions and other wildlife at close range from inside their cars. The format creates an experience that feels intimate and immediate. It also places the visitor in direct proximity to predators that are not domesticated, are not conditioned to ignore humans outside of vehicles, and are not separated from the visitors by any physical barrier other than the vehicle itself, and, critically, its closed windows and doors. The park's safety protocol on this point is explicit and extensively communicated. Over 40 warning signs are displayed throughout the facility instructing visitors to keep windows closed at all times while inside the animal enclosures. The signs are positioned at the entry gate, along the drive routes, and at multiple intervals throughout the lion areas. In addition to the signage, verbal safety briefings are provided to visitors upon entry. Staff communicate the window rule directly. The instruction is not ambiguous. It does not say to keep windows mostly closed, or to use judgment based on the situation. It says windows remain closed at all times. This kind of incident is not unique to this one park. Self-drive safari facilities across South Africa have recorded a series of similar close calls and attacks over the years, almost all of them tracing back to the same failure. A visitor rolling down a window, cracking open a sunroof, or stepping partway out of a vehicle for a better photograph. Wildlife park operators have said repeatedly that the danger is not that the animals are unusually aggressive, but that they they are habituated to vehicles as a fixed, non-threatening presence, while a human body extending beyond that boundary registers as something entirely different and often as prey. The lion enclosures are home to multiple prides. Lions in a drive-through wildlife facility are accustomed to vehicles moving through their territory. They have learned that vehicles are a normal part of their environment. What they have not learned is that the humans inside those vehicles are inaccessible. A closed vehicle is a barrier, an open window is not. Chappell was in the passenger seat of a vehicle moving through the lion area. She had a camera. The vehicle came within less than a meter of arresting Pride. Chappell rolled her passenger window entirely down. A lioness lunged through the open window. The attack was immediate. The lioness reached Chappell through the window opening and delivered a fatal bite to her neck. The other occupants of the vehicle were present at the moment of the attack. Emergency contact was made with park staff, and emergency services were called. Emergency personnel responded to the scene and attempted life-saving measures inside the park. Paramedics on the scene assessed her injuries and attempted cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The neck injury she had sustained in the attack was severe. Efforts to treat her were not successful. Katherine Chappell was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was the neck injury sustained in the lion attack. The park had posted the rule in over 40 locations. The rule had been communicated verbally at entry. The window had been rolled all the way down. Crocodile at Thornton Beach. Cindy Waldron was 46 years old when she went swimming at Thornton Beach in Daintree National Park, Queensland, Australia, on the night of May 29, 2016. Daintree National Park is one of the oldest tropical rainforests on Earth. It sits in far north Queensland and extends to the coastline along the Coral Sea. The park's beaches are surrounded by jungle. The rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters throughout the region are habitat for the estuarine crocodile, also called the saltwater crocodile, the largest reptile species on the planet. Saltwater crocodiles in this part of Queensland are not rare. They are documented, resident, and present in numbers that the Queensland government actively monitors. The estuarine crocodile does not avoid the ocean. It moves between freshwater, brackish water, and open salt water. Thornton Beach is within the crocodile's range. It has always been within the crocodile's range. Wildlife officers in the region conduct regular counts of crocodile populations in local waterways. And Thornton Beach and the nearby Noah Creek estuary have both been documented as active crocodile territory for years prior to this incident. Local guides and tour operators in the Daintree region routinely advise visitors that swimming anywhere along this stretch of coastline day or night carries a real risk of encountering a crocodile, and that the risk increases substantially after dark, when crocodiles are more active and visibility for swimmers drops to nearly nothing. The warning infrastructure at Thornton Beach reflects this reality. Prominent signs at beach access points advise visitors of the presence of estuarine crocodiles. The signs are not easy to miss. They are positioned specifically to be seen by anyone approaching the water. The warning is not qualified. It does not say crocodiles may be present under certain conditions. It communicates that the water at this location is crocodile habitat. Waldron was visiting the beach with a friend. The time was late at night. The conditions were dark. The two women entered the water and waded in to waist depth. A saltwater crocodile, later determined to be 4.3 meters in length, was in the water. The crocodile attacked Waldron. She was grabbed and pulled under. Her friend, who was in the water with her, was not taken. The friend survived and contacted emergency services. Search operations began immediately and continued over multiple days. The scale of the search reflected both the urgency of the situation and the difficulty of conducting operations in a coastal area known to be inhabited by the same species responsible for the attack. Wildlife officers and police worked alongside search teams, and at one point the search prompted a broader public conversation in Queensland about crocodile management policy, since the animal responsible for the attack was large enough and old enough to have been present in that stretch of water for a considerable time. Partial remains were recovered during the search. Cindy Waldron was confirmed dead. The cause of death was a saltwater crocodile attack. The water she entered was marked. The warnings were posted. The night provided no visibility and no advantage. Cabo de Roca cliff fall. A Polish couple visiting Cabo de Roca in Sintra, Portugal in 2014, climbed past the safety barrier at the edge of a cliff, and both fell into the Atlantic Ocean. Their two young children were present and witnessed the fall. Cabo de Roca is a geographic landmark of significant renown. It is the westernmost point of continental Europe, a headland of dramatic cliff faces that drop vertically to the Atlantic. The site draws a large number of tourists annually. The view from the cliff edge is the reason people come. The cliff edge is also extremely dangerous. The rock at the perimeter is not stable granite smoothed by foot traffic. It is crumbling, uneven, and subject to the effects of wind and ocean spray. The surface provides unreliable footing. A safety fence runs along the perimeter of the accessible viewing area, positioned to keep visitors at a safe distance from the edge. The fence marks the boundary between the designated viewing area and the cliff face itself. Local authorities in Sintra have said that incidents at the cliff, ranging from minor injuries to fatal falls, tend to follow a similar pattern, visitors climbing past the fence, specifically to take photographs closer to the edge, often without realizing how unstable the rock surface becomes once it is exposed to the constant wind and salt spray coming off the Atlantic. The headland's exposure to strong coastal winds is well documented, and gusts at the cliff edge can be sudden and forceful even on days that feel calm from within the fenced viewing area. The couple moved past the perimeter fence. They positioned themselves on the cliff edge, on the unstable rock beyond the barrier, to take a photograph. The drop from the edge at that location is approximately 80 meters, roughly 260 feet to the ocean below. Both lost their footing. Both fell. Their two children, who had remained on the visitor side of the safety fence, witnessed the fall from the cliff edge to the water below. Emergency services were contacted. A search and recovery operation was launched in the Atlantic. The ocean at the base of Cabo de Roca is not a calm or accessible environment. The cliffs are sheer and the water below is open Atlantic. Recovery operations in such conditions are complicated by surf, currents, and the depth and character of the water at the base of the cliff face. Both bodies were recovered from the ocean. The couple was confirmed dead. The cause of death was a fall from an approximately 80-meter cliff. The safety fence they had climbed past had been placed at that location for a specific reason. The rock beyond it had given way. Celestine pool dive. David Allen Kirwin was 24 years old on the day in July of 1981 when he dove into Celestine pool at the Lower Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park and did not survive. The Lower Geyser Basin is one of several major thermal areas in Yellowstone. It contains dozens of geothermal features, including hot springs, geysers, and mud pots, spread across a broad, open landscape of mineral-stained soil and rising steam. Celestine pool is a hot spring within the basin, a body of water that sits at approximately 94 degrees Celsius, which is 202 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, contact with water causes severe burns to human skin almost instantaneously. The pool is visually striking, as many Yellowstone thermal features are, with a deep blue color produced by the temperature and mineral composition of the water. It does not look like what it is. It looks like water. Warning signs at the basin inform visitors of the temperatures involved and prohibit entry into any thermal feature. Kirwin was at the basin with a companion. The companion had a dog. At some point during the visit, the dog entered Celestine pool. Bystanders in the area saw what was happening. They called out to Kirwin, warning him not to go into the water. The temperature of the pool was known. Anyone familiar with the site understood what contact with that water would mean. Kirwin's response to the warnings was documented by witnesses. He said, "Like hell I won't," and dove headfirst into the spring. He reached the dog. He swam back to the edge of the pool and got out. The condition of his body when he exited the water was immediately apparent to everyone present. He had sustained third-degree burns across 100% of his body surface. The water at 94 degrees Celsius does not require prolonged exposure to cause damage of that severity. The time Kirwin spent in the pool was enough. Witnesses at the scene later described the moments after he climbed out as chaotic, with bystanders attempting to render whatever assistance they could while someone ran for help. Park staff and emergency responders arrived to find injuries far beyond what could be stabilized on site, and the case is still cited by Yellowstone rangers as one of the clearest examples of how quickly a thermal feature can turn fatal. Since the entire event, from the dog entering the water to Kirwin climbing back out, took place in a span of only a few minutes. First aid was rendered on site by personnel who responded to the scene. Kirwin was transported from the Lower Geyser Basin to a hospital. Medical staff received him and began treatment. The burns he had sustained covered every part of his body. The dog he had gone into the water to reach did not survive. Kirwin did not recover. He died in the hospital the following day. The cause of death was third-degree burns across 100% of his body surface, sustained from immersion in water at approximately 94 degrees Celsius. Bystanders had warned him. He had acknowledged the warning and entered the water anyway, Death Valley German family. In the summer of 1996, a family of 4 German tourists drove into Death Valley National Park in California and did not come back out. Their remains were not found until 2009. Death Valley is not a place that conceals its danger. It is the hottest place on Earth by recorded air temperature, reaching 56.7 degrees Celsius, which is 134 degrees Fahrenheit, at its verified extreme. It is also one of the driest and lowest places on Earth. The landscape is a basin of cracked salt flats, sand dunes, alluvial fans, and rocky mountain terrain that rises thousands of feet on either side of the valley floor. In the summer months, the heat is not merely uncomfortable, it is physiologically threatening within hours for anyone without adequate water, shade, and a reliable means of exit. The Park Service maintains developed roads, staffed visitor centers, and extensive signage warning visitors of the conditions. Backcountry travel in summer requires preparation, water reserves calculated in gallons per person per day, reliable four-wheel drive vehicles suitable for unmaintained terrain, and maps accurate enough to navigate trails that do not appear on standard road maps. The family arrived with a two-wheel drive minivan. They had inadequate maps. Their water supply was almost nothing relative to what a crossing of backcountry Death Valley terrain in midsummer required. The temperature during their visit was approximately 50 degrees Celsius, 124 degrees Fahrenheit. They turned onto an unmaintained backcountry trail. The trail was not designed for a standard two-wheel drive vehicle. The surface consisted of deep sand and rough terrain that demanded the clearance and traction of a vehicle built for off-road conditions. The minivan was not that vehicle. The family sustained 3 flat tires over the course of their attempt to navigate the trail, with 3 flat tires on an unmaintained backcountry route in 50-degree heat. The vehicle eventually became permanently stuck in deep sand. They were miles from any maintained road. They had almost no water. The heat was relentless and had been for however long they had been on the trail. They made the decision to walk out. Death Valley does not have good options for someone on foot in midsummer without water. The distances between any stuck location on a backcountry trail and the nearest maintained road or water source are measured in miles, sometimes dozens of miles, across terrain that offers no shade and no relief from the heat. The sun does not stop. The ground temperature on the valley floor in summer can exceed the air temperature significantly. Walking in those conditions without water is not a survivable plan over any meaningful distance. The family was reported missing. Search efforts were conducted. No trace of the family was found. The search did not locate them. The case remained open. For 13 years, the disappearance stood as one of the park's more puzzling unsolved cases, discussed periodically by park rangers and search and rescue veterans who had worked the original search and never found a resolution. In 2009, approximately 13 years after the family entered the park, their remains were discovered by dedicated search and rescue researchers who had spent years systematically searching the remote backcountry. The discovery finally closed the case, though it also underscored how vast and unforgiving the terrain surrounding the original search area had been, since the family's remains were found a considerable distance from where their vehicle had originally become stuck. The exact sequence of events during their time in the valley, which direction they walked, how far they got, and the order in which they died were not confirmed in public records reviewed. All 4 members of the family were confirmed dead. The cause of death was exposure to extreme heat and dehydration in the desert environment of Death Valley National Park during midsummer. Their vehicle was inadequate for the terrain. Their supplies were inadequate for the conditions. The distance between where they were and where they needed to be was not survivable on foot. Machu Picchu cliff jump. Oliver Park was 51 years old, a German tourist, when he fell more than 100 meters into a ravine at Machu Picchu, Peru, in 2016 while staging a photograph in a restricted area. Machu Picchu is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. The Inca citadel sits on a ridge between 2 mountain peaks in the Cusco region of Peru at an elevation of approximately 2,430 meters above sea level. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Property. It draws hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The terrain at Machu Picchu is not uniformly accessible. The citadel occupies a narrow ridge with significant drops on multiple sides. The site is managed with a system of designated paths, security ropes, and restricted areas that exist specifically to keep visitors away from the locations where a fall would be fatal. These restrictions are posted and enforced by staff stationed throughout the site. Machu Picchu's popularity as a backdrop for dramatic travel photography has, according to site officials, contributed to a recurring problem in which visitors attempt increasingly risky poses near cliff edges to capture a striking image. Officials at the site have periodically discussed tightening enforcement around restricted overlook in response to incidents like this one, since the appeal of an unobstructed photograph often outweighs, in the moment, a visitor's awareness of the terrain immediately beyond the rope line. The cliff edge overlooks at Machu Picchu are among the locations locations where the restrictions are most clearly necessary. At these points, the ground gives way almost immediately to drops that are lethal. The security ropes at restricted overlook are positioned before the ground becomes genuinely dangerous, not at the edge itself. Bypassing them means moving into terrain where the consequence of a stumble or a misstep is a fall measured in hundreds of feet. Park was visiting the site and moved past the security ropes into a restricted cliff edge overlook. He positioned himself at the edge of the drop. His stated purpose was to stage a photograph that would simulate the appearance of flight, to jump into the air and be photographed mid-jump against the backdrop of the ravine and the mountains. He jumped, he slipped when he came down. The landing did not hold. He went over the edge of the overlook and fell more than 100 meters, which is approximately 330 feet into the ravine below. Emergency response personnel at the site were alerted. The ravine at that location is not accessible by any simple route. Recovery of the body required an operation conducted by Peruvian authorities at a site where the terrain itself complicated the effort. The body was eventually recovered from the ravine. Peruvian authorities investigated the incident. The case drew attention to the issue of visitor behavior at restricted areas within the site, and Peruvian officials cited it in the context of ongoing discussions about tourist safety enforcement at Machu Picchu. Oliver Park was confirmed dead. The cause of death was a fall of more than 100 meters into a ravine. The security ropes he bypassed had been placed at that location to prevent exactly that outcome: Antelope Canyon flood. On a day in August of 1997, 11 tourists and one tour guide entered Lower Antelope Canyon near Page, Arizona, and a flash flood killed all 11 visitors. One survived. Lower Antelope Canyon is a slot canyon, a narrow passage carved through sandstone by centuries of water erosion. The walls of the canyon rise steeply on both sides, and in many places nearly converge overhead, leaving only a thin strip of sky visible from the canyon floor. The rock has been shaped into smooth flowing curves by the movement of water over thousands of years. The canyon is extraordinarily narrow. In places, a person can touch both walls simultaneously by extending their arms. The width of the passage in the tightest sections is measured in feet, not yards. There is no room to move laterally and no means of ascending the walls quickly from the canyon floor. The canyon is essentially a channel, and water moving through it has nowhere to go but forward. This is precisely what makes slot canyons in the American Southwest dangerous, in ways that are not immediately apparent to visitors. The weather at the canyon entrance is not the relevant weather. Rain falling miles away in the watershed above the canyon flows across the landscape and funnels into the narrow passages. It does not trickle. It arrives as a wall of water. The volume and force of a flash flood moving through a slot canyon can be extreme, carrying not just water but sand, rock, and debris at speeds that make survival in the canyon's path essentially impossible. The walls cannot be climbed in time. The canyon cannot be exited laterally. The water arrives faster than a person can run. The conditions on the day the group entered Lower Antelope Canyon were clear at the canyon location. There was no rain visible at the entrance. There was no sound of approaching water. The canyon looked as it always looked, a narrow passage of sculpted sandstone with light filtering through the opening above. Miles upstream, a severe thunderstorm had broken out. This kind of weather event in the drainage area above a slot canyon is the documented precursor to a flash flood in the canyon itself. The connection between upstream rainfall and canyon flooding is well established in the region. It is the specific hazard that guides and rangers in the area are trained to monitor. Warnings about regional weather activity had been communicated. The group entered the canyon anyway. The flood arrived. The wall of water and debris that moves through a slot canyon during a flash flood does not announce itself with enough warning to allow for any meaningful response from someone standing on the canyon floor. The sound of approaching water in a narrow canyon can be difficult to distinguish from ambient noise until the flood is close. When it arrives, it fills the passage. 11 of the 12 people in the canyon that day did not get out. One survived. The sole survivor, tour guide Francisco Quintana, was swept along by the current and managed to catch hold of a ledge before being washed onto high ground. Recovery operations began after the flood passed. Finding 11 people inside a narrow sandstone canyon that had just experienced a major flood event was not a simple task. The canyon itself had been altered by the passage of the water and debris. Emergency personnel and recovery teams worked through the site. 9 bodies were eventually recovered from the canyon and the lake downstream, while the remains of 2 French tourists were never found. The incident prompted significant changes to how guided access to Lower Antelope Canyon is managed. The protocols around weather monitoring, entry conditions, and the circumstances under which tours are permitted to proceed were revised following the deaths. Tour operators in the area now require guides to check regional weather forecasts and radar for storm activity across the entire watershed, not just conditions visible at the canyon entrance, before permitting any group to enter. A direct response to what happened that day in 1997. 11 people were confirmed dead. The cause of death was a flash flood inside a slot canyon. The storm that generated the flood had been breaking out in the watershed upstream while the group was on the canyon floor. The canyon had no exits. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.